This is some time where we're going to look at God's Word, we're going to look at the Scriptures. So if you've got a Bible with you, it could be a hard copy, it could be on your phone, it could be on a tablet, I don't really mind, as long as you've got the Bible with you. And we're in 1 Thessalonians. So it's in the New Testament, and it's sort of midway, I reckon, in the New Testament. It's a letter, it's only quite short. And some of you will know that a couple of weeks back, or more than a couple of weeks back now, actually, a couple of sessions back, so it was the first Sunday of April. The first Sunday of April, we launched this new teaching series, which is based on this letter, or these letters, depending how far we get. 1 Thessalonians and possibly 2 Thessalonians. So just a little bit of a recap, just for those of you who weren't there, just to give you the context. So 1 Thessalonians is written to a group of Christians in a city called Thessalonica. Thessalonica was the capital city of a region of the Roman Empire called Macedonia. And this story of Paul bringing the gospel with his friends and companions, people like Timothy and Silas and Luke and Priscilla and Aquila, all those people. You can read about it in Acts 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20. So if you want to read the context for how this letter was written, it's Acts 16, 17, 18 and 19. Just read through those 4 chapters and you'll begin to see some of the contrast and cities that are mentioned that are in this letter. So this letter is probably the very first letter that Paul wrote. So again, if you know your New Testament, if you know anything about the way that the New Testament's made up, then there's a number of letters that are written by this man called Paul, who was an apostle. He was one of the leaders of the church, and he wrote a number of letters. This is probably his first, and he probably only spent 3 weeks in Thessalonica. This is in Acts 17. So he only spent 3 weeks. The reason he only spent 3 weeks was because of the depth and breadth of persecution that took place as a response to the good news. And so he had to escape quite quickly. So that's the context. And the way that we're using this letter is to think about and reflect on what are the marks of a spirit-filled church. If we claim as a church to be spirit-filled, then what would that look like? And what does that look like in my life, in your life, in our life together as a corporate body? So I want to read a few verses this morning. So we're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And we're going to start reading from verse 1. It says, "You yourselves, dear brothers and sisters, you knew that our visit to you was not a failure." So again, just think about that. Paul's writing, this is about a year later, okay? It's about a year later writing this letter. He's been there for 3 weeks. You know that wasn't a failure. You know how badly we had been treated in Philippi just before we came to you and how much we suffered there. So again, you can read that in Acts 16 and then go into Acts 17. So Acts 16 is all about Philippi, what goes on in Philippi. Paul's referring to that here. You know what happened, how we were treated badly before we came to you and how much we suffered there. Yet, our God gave us the courage to declare this good news to you boldly in spite of great opposition. So you can see that we were preaching to you not with any deceit or impure motives or trickery. For we speak as messengers approved by God to be entrusted with the good news. Our purpose is not to please God, but to please people. Sorry, read that again. Just making sure you're listening. Good to hear that you are. Our purpose is to please God, not people. He alone examines the motives of our hearts. Never once did we try to win you over with flattery, as you well know. And God is our witness that there was no pretending to be your friends just to get your money. Or, as for human praise, we never sought it from you or anyone else. So as apostles of Christ, we certainly had the right to make demands on you, but instead we were like children amongst you. Or we were like a mother feeding and caring for our own children. We loved you so much that we shared with you not only God's good news, but our own lives too. So don't you remember, dear brothers and sisters, how hard we worked amongst you? Night and day we toiled to earn a living so that we would not be a burden to you, or any of you as we preach the good news to you. You yourselves are our witnesses, and so is God, that we were devout and honest and faultless towards all of you believers. And you know that we treated each of you as fathers treat his own children. We pleaded with you, encouraged you, urged you to live your lives in a way that God would consider worthy. For he called you to share in his kingdom and glory. So I guess what I want to home in on is verse 12. Verse 12 says, we pleaded with you, encouraged you and urged you to live your lives in a way that God considered, so that God would consider worthy. And I think what I want to just reflect on is, if we're going to be a spirit-filled church, then one of the marks of that would be that we are a church that looks like and acts like Jesus. It might seem pretty 101. You know, we are a church after all. Church exists for people who know Jesus, who've come together as a community to strengthen, encourage, urge one another on. But so easily we can get caught up in lots of other things around church. And so this sense of living a life worthy, that there's something about our lives that are honouring to God and are recognisable to people around us, that hey, so-and-so or this person, they claim to call themselves a Christian. And I want to do it around, to make it easy, I want to do it around 3 points. Good Baptist preach. 3 points, all beginning with the same letter. Ooh, isn't that good? You excited? Yeah. So the first thing I want to talk about is courage. Paul, in the context that we're writing here, is, as you know, he's come from Philippi, and in Philippi, he's been really persecuted. They've been chased out of that town because of who he was. And actually, in Philippi, if you know the story, Paul ends up in prison. He ends up in prison with a friend of his called Silas. And so they're in prison in Philippi because they are preaching the gospel. And that all works itself out, and you can read about it. There's some amazing, miraculous moments in Philippi. Not least that they escaped from prison. Anyway, you think then, Paul has just had this experience in Philippi. What shall he do? I think I'll perhaps go home and put my feet up for a while. It's been really tough in Philippi. But he doesn't do that. What he does, he then moves on to the next town, the next city, which is Thessalonica. And there's something about Paul that has courage. And I don't know what your definition of courage is. Or what you think about when you think about somebody courageous. And if we're not careful, if we sort of can sort of over-romanticize courage. Or we can put courage into a category of people that we could never be like. Do you ever do that? Do you ever sort of compare yourself with people who think, oh, so-and-so and so-and-so, they're great, but you know what, I can never quite be like them? And we can do that with courage. But courage, I think, at its heart is actually knowing and facing fear and doing it anyway. It's like courage doesn't make you superhuman, it doesn't make you super special. Courage is actually recognising that there's something going on inside us about our, and this is the second C, our convictions, that causes us to do things that make us step out of things that are uncomfortable or potentially fearful. And Paul is writing about that in this letter. He talks, doesn't he, right at the beginning of this little chapter, that yet our God has given us courage to declare his good news. And I suppose as we come into this phase of life right now, all that's gone on in the last couple of years, and the context of our nation where there is a lot of fear and anxiety, and that's layered upon layers as you look up and look at the news, and if you read about what's going on in Ukraine and what Putin is saying and what might be happening or what could develop, and is this going to be World War III, and all those things can be so overwhelming. It's so important, isn't it, to then step back into this relationship that we are called into and have the privilege of walking in with God. Amen. Because as that verse that I read as we came out of the worship says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. Amen. And fear is such a powerful emotion. And it demonstrates itself in all sorts of ways. Worry, anxiety. All those sort of emotional dynamics that go on inside us. And I guess one of the things that we're trying to work out, do you want to let Andy in? I think he's stuck out there. Here he comes. Is like, how do we, in the present context of life, and I guess we've got all that stuff going on, but also at the same time, we have to recognise as well that Christianity, in terms of its place in society, is moving and has moved to the margins. So Christianity has moved to the margins of our culture. And depending on where you are in terms of age, I think, we're probably all aware of this to some degree, but actually the younger you get, the more I think you live in a context where, the younger you get, you live in a context where actually Christianity is the minority worldview. Am I right with that? I think I'm right. I think looking at some of the young adults, is that right? I don't know. It's hard for all of us. It doesn't matter whether you're 70 or 7. We have to recognise that culture has shifted, and therefore, how do we live as Christians? Well, one of the ways that we need to live and what we need to have is some level of courage. Because some of the things that we believe and some of the things that we are seeking to live out are countercultural right now. Yeah. And some of the things that maybe 30 years, 40 years ago, we would have been saying this is right and this is wrong. You could almost argue that, and now you're saying that is right and this is wrong. And so as church, and I've been reflecting on this personally, and it's like, how courageous am I? How much courage do I have to sometimes stand up and say what I think, what I believe? And so that's what Paul is talking about. I think is one of the marks of a church, is that we're going to be courageous people. But the courage that we need isn't something that we have to then work up inside ourselves. It's something that comes from God. So if you read Joshua, one of those books in the Old Testament, the story of Joshua who takes over from Moses, it's God who says to him in that opening chapter, be strong, be courageous, for I am with you. And I guess that's the key to our courage, is to know that God is with us. And God is with us today because of His Spirit. The Holy Spirit has been given to us. And we're in this season right now where we're working towards and heading towards Pentecost. So courage is really important. But with that courage, we also, I think, have to then balance that with the third C, which is compassion. I love the way that Paul describes it in this passage. He talks about it, doesn't he? Verse 7 and onwards, he says, we were with you like a mother feeding and caring for her own children. We treated you as fathers treat their own children. So Paul talks about this compassion that is motivating him, the kindness that he is demonstrating, the way that he went. He could have come in really strong, saying, right, I'm the apostle, and as the apostle, then you need to do this, this, and this to look after me. you need to provide for me, you need to resource me financially, and you need to resource me with food and a place to live and all that stuff. But he doesn't do that in Thessalonica. He comes and actually doesn't want to be a burden. He comes to serve them. He comes to nurture them. He comes with this compassion that is expressed in the heart of a father and the heart of a mother. And so, I think it's so important, because I think, again, as Christians, if we're not careful, this is, my personal reflection would be, as I look at Christians, if we talk too much about courage and boldness, we end up becoming a little bit too forceful, a little bit too unaware of the sort of context. So we almost demand to be heard. And I think sometimes in our world, in our country, the whole thing of whether we are a Christian country or a post-Christian country or a pre-Christian country, and what are the rights of a Christian. What we have to be careful of as Christians, I think, is not to demand a voice in that sense. I think we have to be careful that our boldness doesn't become inappropriate. Does that make sense? And I'm sure, you may be aware of that. You may have seen that. You may have read that. Jesus always talks about, didn't he, truth and grace. And I guess courage and compassion are together. That if we're going to be bold, if we're going to be courageous, if we want to stand up and speak up about things, then the motivation of our hearts has to be compassion. Because whatever issue that we're sort of wanting to talk about, we have to remember that underneath issues are always people. People who are living lives, and some of those lives will be broken in lots of ways, or their identity might be caught up in something that they believe, and we have to work that out in a compassionate and a courageous way. And so that's what Paul is talking about, I think, here. That the testimony of those 3 weeks was that here was Paul and here was Silas, and they were bringing this good news. And I guess that's the message that we need to have courage in. The courage that we carry good news in who we are and what we are about. To have the courage to do that, to stand up for that, to speak out for that. Even maybe the courage to invite a friend to come and hear somebody else speak about this, which is the God Loves You tour. But I think my final thing, just as I reflect on this, is that if you've got courage and you've got compassion, I guess in the midst of that is this sense that I think Paul talks about here, in this little passage, is this awareness that there's a conviction of life that you have to be careful that you don't go beyond. I don't know if I'm making sense here. I hope I can communicate. When I was thinking about it, it reminded me of something that we talk about, which is your conscience. So your conscience is that part of you, isn't it, that in terms of moral behaviour, generally your conscience is what stops you from doing something. Would that be fair? And so your conscience, I think your conscience can be nurtured one way or another. And sometimes your conscience can then be lessened so that there are things that you would do, or your things that you wouldn't do, that you're able to sort of block out in your conscience. And if your conscience is really heightened, then there are certain things that you just won't do. So Sue and I talked about this quite a lot in terms of what do you allow yourself to watch on the tally or at the cinema? Do you ever ask that question of yourself? What games on the computer would you play or not play? What websites on the internet would you visit or not visit? Some of that is tied up with, I think, what you allow your conscience to take a lead on. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Not in a guilty, I don't want to make you feel guilty, but what I do want to do is give God the opportunity to convict you. Because sometimes we need to be convicted. That's slightly different than guilt. But there are certain things that we should or shouldn't do. And I guess that courage and that compassion is really important, isn't it? Because if you're in a context, and I was reading about this, some friends of ours have got a 15-year-old teenager. And the 15-year-old teenager, all of his friends are playing 18-plus games. Maybe some of your parents will have that already with 15-year-olds. So what do you do as a parent if you've got a 15-year-old and all of their friends are playing 18-year-old games? I'm not going to give the answer, because you need to work that out as a family, don't you? You need to work out what is the courage to say no to this, and what is your conviction, and what is your conscience allowing you to watch or not watch. And actually, does it really matter what you watch or not watch? I would argue that it does. Because what comes into your mind, into your eyes, through your eyes, seems to impact you emotionally and spiritually and in all sorts of ways. So, this is what it means to be a spirit-filled church. It's like, generally, I have a rule that I will not watch 18s. So if a film is classed at 18, my general rule is I won't watch it. That's just our general rule. Sue and I talked about it. There are some things that we have watched. We talked about it, we ended up watching it. And primarily that's because I don't necessarily want to watch something that's got a high level of vulgar language. I don't want to be watching something that every other word is, you know the words. Yeah. And I don't really want to be watching stuff that's got hints of pornography in it, to be really blunt. And I guess these are the things that we have to have courage and compassion with, don't we? So my compassion is, it's really hard to make those choices. It's really hard to have that conversation if you've got a 15-year-old child who is wanting, all of his friends are watching 18, so how do you navigate that as a family? We need to help one another, we need to give courage and we need to give compassion to work that out. But we also need to talk about our conviction and our conscience. And so the Bible is there for us in terms of teachings of the Bible and what the Bible brings into our lives to give us these boundaries, these fixed understanding of what is good for us, what makes us fully human, that is for our good. And so that's part of being a spirit-filled church. And I guess that's all caught up in this context of being people of good news. So actually the teachings of the Bible on different subjects and different issues and different dynamics are all under the umbrella of being good news. So I actually would argue that it's good news, isn't it, to make a moral choice. Even if that moral choice would be that everybody around you is making the opposite choice. Because God is at the heart of this, and God has got good news for you. He wants to work in our lives and through our lives and to help us in this context of Thessalonica to be a people that stand out differently. And I guess my final comment would be, let's not kid ourselves. The result of Philippi and Thessalonica was persecution. Now, hear me on this. I don't think we're being persecuted in the United Kingdom right now. Again, I think we have to be a little bit measured with the way that we see ourselves compared to other places in the world. So if you talk to Ugo or to Nick, who are our champions for open doors, if you want to know about persecution and persecuted churches. But there is no doubt that the more we stand up or talk about things that are right and wrong, there will be some kickback. Does that make sense? Well, we have to be ready for that. We have to be aware of that, because Christianity is now on the margins of our society. I actually think that's the best place we can be, personally. I don't think Christianity does very well when it's at the centre. It has all the power. That's the history of Europe. So, got to think about that. Christianity works so well when it's at the margins. When actually we are subversive in that sense. Living out our lives as Christians, but being different in how we live, how we speak, how we work, how we act, how we give, all those things. So, this is what Paul is talking about. This is, for me, the mark. So, it's about being courageous. It's about being compassionate. And underneath that, it's about having these convictions and this conscience that you're working out. And maybe these are the conversations we need to encourage ourselves to have around our dinner tables, around our small group tables. It's like, how can we recognise if our conscience is actually being compromised? Why do we make certain decisions to draw a line and say, I will do that, but you know what, I won't do that? Not because I'm a killjoy or I'm a rule. It's because actually this is good news. God wants the best for you, and actually making that choice is going to be good news for you, your family, and for our nation. Guys, the worship team, you want to come back up? Just going to have a little bit of time of responding, just what I've said or what's been going on this morning, and just chatting with Ed before in terms of a song that we could just sing that would help us, and we landed on the song Oceans. Some of you will know that song. Just some of the words I think in that song will just reflect maybe some of the things that we're thinking about or asking God to help us with. So we'll start this time by encouraging you either to stand or you can remain seated. That's up to you. But we'll sing this song and then we'll just take a few minutes. We've got 10 minutes or so, just to have a little bit of space before we go into the next phase of our day, just to respond to God and to what He might be saying to you through what you've heard this morning.